Brethren, in the very beginning portion, the early part of this month, there was a holiday that was celebrated in the Jewish community that we do not normally observe in the Church of God. It was a holiday, or is a holiday that is mentioned in Scripture, but it is not enjoined or commanded in Scripture. It is not a part of the holy days listed in Leviticus 23, but it is something of which we read. We read a passing mention of it in the New Testament. It was, and is not, even by the Jews, considered holy time in the same sense that the commanded festivals of Leviticus 23 are considered. Nevertheless, it was a particular holiday that had its origin in events that happened in the period that we call between the Testaments. The Old Testament ends with, in terms of the chronological story, with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the book of Malachi. That gives you brings the story up to approximately 400 BC. And that's really where the direct biblical account in the Old Testament ends with those books, and you come up to approximately 400 BC. The story picks up again in the New Testament with the Gospels, and there is approximately a 400-year gap between the story told in the Old Testament and the beginning of the story told in the New Testament. However, that's not a complete gap, because particularly in the book of Daniel, that period is directly referenced in terms of prophecy. Daniel wrote about those things ahead of time that were to happen and transpire during that period of time between the Testaments as well. Of course, in the book of Daniel is going on beyond that, going on down to our day and beyond. And on down to the time, as Daniel speaks, of when the God of heaven shall set up a kingdom that shall never end. Now, in the book of John, chapter 10, we read a reference to the fact that, John 10, verse 22, that it was at Jerusalem, the feast of the dedication, and it was winter. And Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. So Jesus Christ was there on this occasion. Now, the Feast of Dedication, celebrated during the winter, is perhaps better known to us by its Hebrew name, which is Hanukkah. And that, of course, means the Feast of Dedication. Now, I want to focus our attention in on something using the events that surrounded this festival, and to understand something about the whole subject of dedication, and what it is that undermines dedication, what it is that ensures continued long-term dedication. Now, as we go back to the book of Daniel, let's pick up the story prophetically in terms of what God reveals through Daniel was going to occur. And we're going to find that there was a problem, there was a conflict that arose that has had many guises down through the centuries. It is not a new conflict. It is one that the people of God have faced over and over and over and will continue to face in the future. We'll pick it up in Daniel chapter 11. Daniel describes here the dating of this is shortly after the fall of the Babylonian kingdom in the first year after the fall of Babylon and the onset of the empire of the Medes and the Persians ruling from Babylon. And Daniel foresees in a vision that there will yet be significant kings in Persia, and a fourth king, the fourth of these significant kings, will be far richer than they all. There will be this one man who will have remarkable wealth and will use his wealth to stir up, try to put together an alliance against the realm of Grecia. Now, this is a reference to Xerxes, the Persian king, who put together a vast army. In fact, it was one of the largest armies of the ancient world. It was an army of over 1 million men, and they marched to the area of Asia Minor, to the area of the Hellespont, as it was called at that time. It's what's now modern-day Turkey, right across the straits from Greece, where if you look on a map, you see the Black Sea to the north, and Greece and Turkey, and then the Mediterranean in that area of the Dardanelles, anciently called the Hellespont. Xerxes led his army. And his idea was he was going to invade Greece. Well, his invasion didn't work out. It was unsuccessful, but there were a number of battles, and there were alliances of the Greek city-states that came together in the aftermath of that. Well, Xerxes went back to his palace, to Shushan, but the result was that there was ferment in the Greek world. And as Daniel describes in Daniel 11, verse 3, a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven and not to his posterity. Now, what we find, of course, is that there was a mighty king that stood up in Grecia. There was actually initially a man by the name of Philip of Macedon sought to put together an alliance that involved all the Greek city-states. He died, and his son Alexander inherited the throne of Macedonia and the Greek world, which his father had put together. And Alexander led the Greek troops across the Hellespont into Asia, which, of course, is what is now modern-day Turkey. And he launched over the next 12 years the most amazing story of conquest, coming all the way from Europe, across through Asia, going all the way to modern Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan. He came up to the Indus River. He went all the way down through Egypt. He put together a vast empire over the entire Middle Eastern area, going even into the modern nations of India and Afghanistan, in the course of about 12 years. He stood up, did this remarkable thing, and died. Died as a very young man, and died in Babylon. And his empire, instead of going to his descendants, he had an infant son. Actually, a son. The son was not even born at the time of Alexander's death, but was born a couple of months later, and would have been in line to have inherited the throne. But this was not to be. There were several of his generals that ultimately boiled down to four of them that divided his empire four different ways. It was divided toward the four winds, just as Daniel foretold. This is bringing us down to approximately 300 B.C. A little before that, actually, the date generally given for the beginning of is 312 for the Greek world, the Seleucid kingdom. There are four generals that things were divided up among, but there were two who were significant from a biblical standpoint, because one of those kings, or generals initially, a man by the name of Seleucus, took a territory north of Judea and Jerusalem, stretching across from what's the modern-day nations of Syria and Iraq. And he took that portion. And he was north of Jerusalem. And there was another general, a man by the name of Ptolemy, that was south of Jerusalem, centered in Egypt. And so these two individuals are referred to throughout the rest of the chapter as the king of the north and the king of the south. One being south of Jerusalem, one being north of Jerusalem. And the other two kings that were inherited Alexander's empire were elsewhere, actually in Greece and Asia Minor. So they didn't really figure into the story involving the Bible. Now, one thing you can readily imagine, that with Judea and Jerusalem being between these two kings, it was, of course, up for grabs. And for a number of years, it was initially part of the southern kingdom, ruled by the Ptolemies from Egypt. Later on, it was conquered by the Seleucids from the north. And there was warfare between the Ptolemies in the south and the Seleucids in the north, which meant that Judea was caught in the fighting back and forth. Now, we're not going to go through all of the details of the prophecy here, because I want to get down to something that is significant in regards to this matter of the Feast of Dedication. But to set the stage a little bit, realize that the Greek world, that one thing about the aftermath of Alexander's empire, Alexander had the idea of creating one world. That was his goal. That was his ideal. One language, one culture, one religion, one world. Now that wasn't a new idea with Alexander. You can go all the way back to Genesis 10 and the Tower of Babel and read about Nimrod, and that was his desire. Well, Alexander sought to put that together when he died, and his empire was divided up. Even though the empire was divided, it was still a Greek empire. Hellenistic was the term, coming from Hellenes or Hellas, which was the name that the Greeks used for themselves, and the Hellenistic culture, the Greek language, the Greek culture, the Greek religion, all of these things that Alexander sought to use to unite the world. Well, the generals that succeeded him were Greek, and they all held to this worldview that was a Greek worldview. You know, the Greeks viewed that there were two categories of people. There were Greeks and barbarians. If you weren't a Greek, you were a barbarian. Barbarian referred to everyone who was not a Greek. So that was sort of their perspective. So the thing was, what you needed to do was to, if you wanted to quit being a barbarian, you needed to learn Greek and act like the Greeks and adopt their culture, their philosophy, their religion. The main argument that Ptolemy and Seleucus and all the other generals had was not over whether there ought to be one world that was a Greek world. Their argument was which one of them ought to be in charge of it. And that was the dispute. So the Greek language and culture spread across the whole Middle Eastern area and really much of the Mediterranean world. Now, we pick up the story here as we come on down in Daniel chapter 11, referring here to the Seleucid kingdom, this, as it's called, the king of the north, describes the death of a particular king in verse 20. And in his estate, verse 21, shall stand up a vile person, whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Now, historically, that is a reference to a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus was not in line for the throne. His brother died, and his father died, and his brother succeeded the throne, and his brother did not reign for a very lengthy time. His brother had a young son that was in line for the throne. Antiochus, who had been in Rome, came back to the area, and he entered into various intrigue. He was a very crafty, a very politically astute individual. He didn't come in with an army and conquer it. No, he entered in peaceably. He was not the one to whom they were to give the honor of the kingdom. In reality, he was a very vile person. But he was clever. He used various stratagems, and he accomplished his purpose in terms of obtaining the kingdom. And then we find that he entered into warfare there with Judea. And we find that he would enter peaceably, even to the fattest places of the province. And he stirred up, verse 25, armies against the king of the south. And he came against him with a great army. And as we come on down through the story, we find in verse 30 that the ships of Kittim came against him. Kittim was the ancient name for Sicily and refers here to the Roman fleet. Antiochus was on the verge of actually conquering Egypt. That was his desire. He wanted to unite, you see, the king of the north and the king of the south. He wanted to unite this Greek realm, and the Romans did not want to see this Greek realm united. They wanted to keep them divided, and so they came in with the Roman fleet to help out, to be in alliance with the Ptolemies of Egypt. And Antiochus didn't want to go up against both of them, so he returned. And we notice that when he returned, we're told, he had indignation against the Holy Covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength. They shall take away the daily sacrifice, and shall place the abomination that makes desolate. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupted by flatteries, but the people who do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Now, notice what we find here. He comes back and he enters into intrigue with those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Understand what was taking place in Judea at this time. If you go all the way back to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, you find that all through the story, both when the initial return, in the aftermath of the initial return from Babylon with Zerubbabel, there began to be conflict and trouble with some of the surrounding nations who were antagonistic toward what was being done in Jerusalem. By the time you come on down about 60 years later to the time that Ezra returned as a priest to Jerusalem, you find that the very identity of the people of God in Judea was threatened. There had come about so much intermingling, intermarriage, connection with the various pagan peoples of the land that the whole nation was on the verge of really losing its identity as the people of God. Ezra, later backed up and reinforced by the civil government when Nehemiah returned several years later as governor. There were reforms that were emphasized, and the story, particularly in the book of Nehemiah, is the attempt to finish the work, to institute these reforms, to establish the clear identity of the people of God. And there was a struggle because some of these problems had originated high up in terms of the leadership. Now, the result of it was things were sort of settled out by the time Ezra and Nehemiah died, but as we come on down through the story, by the time Alexander's troops spread across that area, and this whole area became under the Greek rule, we find that Hellenistic culture acted like a magnet to draw people. This happened all through the Middle East, but it also happened in Judea. There were increasingly large numbers of people who were enticed. They were attracted. They wanted to be part of this larger Greek world. And the things that separated them and that made them distinct, they began to look askance at and to sort of see if there was some other way. You find that many of them adopted Greek names in place of their Hebrew names. They began to seek Greek culture. One of the things that was the center of Greek culture in any particular city was the gymnasium. Now, that included more than what we think. It included exercise, but there were religious connotations, and it was the whole gamut of what went on in the Greek world. And this was really a center of Greek culture. And there were a lot of aspects to Greek culture. I think that, one thing just from a moral standpoint, the Apostle Paul refers to it in Romans chapter 1. I think that many times we don't realize the extent to which homosexuality was prevalent and was a major factor in Greek culture. You can go all the way back to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and if you read their writings on the subject, not sort of the little excerpts that they give in the textbooks, but if you go back and read what they actually said in entirety, you'll find out that was their focus. They looked to that and they elevated that, and the gymnasium was the center of that sort of activity. All the activities in the gymnasium took place in the nude, and there were a lot of things along that line. Paul makes reference in Romans chapter 1 to the fact that when they knew God, they didn't want to glorify Him as God, neither were thankful, became vain in their imagination, their foolish heart was darkened. That's the way you progress, you see, from truth to error, by the way. It not only applied to the Greek and Roman world. Paul was directly addressing the ancient Greek and Roman world in Romans 1. The Greeks were the educators of the Romans. Rome conquered Greece, but politically and militarily, but philosophically, educationally, culturally, Greece conquered Rome. The Romans imported Greek teachers to teach them, and even the Greek language itself became very common, very prevalent in Italy for quite a while. In fact, remained the prevalent language in southern Italy on up even into the early medieval period. But the point is, this progression that takes someone away from God, when they know God, they don't glorify Him as God, they're not thankful. They don't appreciate what they have. They exalt the self. They became vain in their imagination. Their foolish heart was darkened. Paul then went on to explain in Romans chapter 1 how the sort of the pace setters, the intellectuals, the leaders of the Greek and Roman world had been given up to vile affections, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, men with men working that which is unseemly, as Paul explains in Romans 1, describes very clearly what transpired, and this is what took place. Now, there were a number of aspects of Greek culture, but perhaps the simplest thing in terms of contrast is that there was a totally different worldview that was a Greek worldview from a Hebrew worldview. The Hebrew worldview, the biblical worldview, was a God-centered world. A God-centered worldview. Everything revolved around God and around man's relationship with God. It revolved around obedience to God, pleasing God, living in conformity with God's law and with God's commandments. It was a God-centered worldview. And everything was looked at in terms of its relationship to God and whether or not it was pleasing to God. The Greek worldview was different. The Greek worldview was very much of a man-centered worldview. It was an individual. It was a very individualistic approach in terms of looking at at man, at looking at the individual. There were many different things that came out of that. In fact, this stuff isn't really ancient history. You come all the way down till today, and you find that there is still that contrast, because our modern world our modern Western world are the intellectual heirs of the Greek world, of the Hellenistic world. And our modern secular society has very much of the old Greek worldview. It is a man-centered world, as opposed to the biblical view of a God-centered worldview. Now, what happened was that people all over were attracted to this. This was new, this was modern, this was the cutting edge. This seemed to be spreading. It had spread militarily through Alexander's conquest, and then it spread by attraction in terms of enticing people from all these surrounding cultures wanting to be a part of this. And it also happened right in Judea. And we find even in the high priestly family that this occurred, and all the way down. And so Antiochus, after his return from Egypt, entered into intrigue with those who forsook the Holy Covenant. You see, they didn't want to live by the law of God. And there were two different aspects of what he did. One, of course, was the matter of enticing, attracting. He entered into intrigue with those who had chosen to forsake the covenant, but then, having a large army, also having the agreement of a significant part, probably even the majority of the population, that had gone along to some extent with what he was trying to do, he decided that he was in a position to enforce an end to biblical practices. And so he shut down the temple, wound up rededicating it to Jupiter Olympus, offered swine's flesh on the altar, did these various things, set up a statue of Jupiter Olympus. Now, Daniel gives us the account of the story from a prophetic standpoint, describes what would happen, or what did happen. I want to read you some excerpts from a contemporary source, a source that was written at the time of these struggles that were going on, to give you a little bit of the historical background. This is taken from the book of 1 Maccabees. That was never intended to be a part of Scripture. It wasn't written as Scripture. The Jews never considered it Scripture, but it is a contemporary historical account. So we notice that Antiochus polluted the sanctuary, and we're told in verse 32, such as do wickedly against the covenant, this is Daniel 11:32, such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupt by flatteries. They will be enticed by words. You know, people are allured to the idea that they will achieve power, they will achieve status, they will achieve money. They were enticed to go along with this system. They looked upon this is dominant, this is what's going to be in control, this is what's going to rule, and so I want to fit in, I want to be a part of it. Such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupt by flatteries. The people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And so the story comes down to what transpired. Now let me read you here some excerpts from Maccabees. There came out of one of them a wicked root, Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes. In those days there went out from Israel wicked men, who persuaded many, saying, let's go and make a covenant with the nations that are round about us. For since we departed from them, we've had much sorrow. And the device pleased them well. Then certain of the people were so forward herein that they went to the king, who gave them license to do after the ordinances of the heathen. Whereupon they built a place of exercise at Jerusalem, according to the custom of the heathen. They made themselves uncircumcised. Actually underwent an operation. They didn't want to stand out in any way from the Greeks there in the gymnasium. They wanted to fit in, to be a part of that. So they were prepared to get rid of any evidence of the covenant relationship that God had established with Abraham. They made themselves uncircumcised and forsook the holy covenant and joined themselves to the heathen and were sold to do mischief. And it talks about Antiochus, when he had smitten Egypt, he returned and entered proudly into the sanctuary and took away the golden altar and the candlestick of light and the vessels thereof. And a little later, an army came back, and they shed innocent blood on every side of the sanctuary and defiled it, insomuch that the inhabitants of Jerusalem fled because of them, whereupon the city was made a habitation of strangers. King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and every one should leave his laws. So all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king. Yes, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion and sacrificed unto idols and profaned the Sabbath. So there were many who were enticed by that. Understand, and I'm not primarily getting into the prophetic implications today, but when you go through Daniel 11, it's very clear, and there are several other scriptures in Daniel, that make it very clear that Antiochus is really a type of the end-time beast power. And when you read what he did, you read that, the things that he did, the things that he accomplished, were really a prelude to the Great Tribulation, or a type, rather, of the Great Tribulation. Jesus Christ used those things in Matthew 24 as types and illustrations, and talked about a future abomination of desolation. And so what did Antiochus do? First, there was a pressure. Everyone needs to join together. We need to be one people. This is going to produce peace and prosperity. So many were caught up in that. They voluntarily went in with this system. But you see, just those that voluntarily went in was not enough. Once he had put together what he could through attraction, then he proceeded to try to deal with the rest through intimidation. Ultimately, there are primarily two reasons, why people forsake the way of God and do the things that they shouldn't do in terms of following the world around them. One is through attraction and enticement. They are allured. They are enticed. They look at it and they are attracted to the glitter and the glamour. They are attracted to what the book of Hebrews calls the pleasures of sin for a season. So they are attracted by the desire to fit in and to be a part of things. And so enticement, attraction is one, and the other is intimidation. To put pressure on, and you can intimidate people in a variety of ways. The most extreme, of course, is the threat of death, which Antiochus brought in. You can have economic pressure and social pressure and various restrictive laws and things that come in and that make it very difficult for people to survive and function. And you can create an intimidation that makes people feel the necessity of sort of going along. And you can, threaten them with jail. You can threaten them with death. Now, Antiochus had attracted, and not only him personally, but the Greek culture had served as an attraction to many. Antiochus capitalized on that, but he was not satisfied with just those that had been attracted to it. He wanted to insist that there would be one world. And of course, this is very much descriptive of events of the future, as we know from other prophecies. Well, Antiochus sent this decree out. So many of the Israelites consented to his religion, and sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers unto Jerusalem and the cities of Judah that they should follow the strange laws of the land, and forbade burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the temple, and that they should profane the Sabbaths and festival days, and pollute the sanctuary and holy people, set up altars and groves and chapels of idols, and sacrifice swine's flesh and unclean beasts, that they should leave their children uncircumcised and make their souls abominable with all manner of uncleanness and profanation, to the end that they might forget the law and change all the ordinances. And whosoever would not do according to the commandment of the king, he said he should die. So here we have a type of the Great Tribulation. Antiochus profaned the sanctuary and then began to enforce these decrees. And this, of course, is a type, a forerunner of what Jesus described in Matthew 24 and what we read of in the book of Revelation and other places. Well, what we find was that many of the people were gathered unto them, everyone that forsook the law, and so they committed evils in the land. And on the 15th day of the month Keslev, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar, and built idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side, and burned incense at the doors of their houses and in the streets. And when they had rent in pieces the books of the law which they found, they burned them with fire. Sought to destroy the Bible, to wipe out any copies of the Scriptures that they were able to find. And whosoever was found with any book of the Testament, or if any consented to the law, the king's commandment was that they should put him to death. Became a death penalty, a matter of death penalty to possess a copy of the Scriptures. So they did all sorts of terrible things. And we're told, as the story goes on, that in those days arose Matthias, who was a priest from Jerusalem and dwelt in Modin, which was a small town or village out from Jerusalem. And Matthias the priest had 5 sons, John and Simon and Judas, who was called Maccabee, Eleazar and Jonathan. Maccabee meant hammer, and that was what Judas was. He just hammered away at things, as you read on the story. And that's where the term Maccabees and the Maccabee revolt came from. Well, he and his sons left Jerusalem in the aftermath of this. And in the meantime, the king's officers, such as compelled the people to revolt, came into the city of Modin to make them sacrifice. And when many of Israel were come to them, Matthias and his sons came together. So they came in with these, band of troops, and they called the whole village into assembly. And now, the king's officer said to Matthias, "You are a ruler and an honorable and great man in this city. strengthened with sons and brethren. You know, you've got a big family, you're a man of influence, you're a priest, you're an elderly man that everyone around here looks up to. You're a person of prominence. We want you to come first. Therefore come you first and fulfill the king's commandment, like as all the heathen have done. Yes, and the men of Judah also, and such as remain at Jerusalem. Everybody's doing it. Everybody's doing it. And we want you to come and set an example right here in this village where you are respected and looked to and or have so many family members. We want you to come. So you and your house be in the number of the king's friends. You know, it's going to really be to your advantage to do this because, you know, you'll be on the king's good side. You'll be on the list of the king's friends. And if there's one thing you don't want to be, it's on the list of the king's enemies. You and your children will be honored with silver and gold and many rewards. It's really going to be your advantage. So look at the arguments they make. Number one, everybody else is doing it. People everywhere are doing it. People in all the countries around. People in Judah are doing it. Everybody's left in Jerusalem. They've all gone along. So everybody's doing it, number one. It's really going to be to your advantage, number two, because the king, you'll be one of the king's friends. The king will look with a smile on anyone that has sort of helped him to do this. So everybody's doing it. You'll be in good with the king. Plus, we will reward you. It'll be to your financial advantage. You know, we'll reward you. Now, those arguments ought to win just about anybody, shouldn't they? Well, they didn't win Matthias. Matthias said, answered and spoke with a loud voice, though all the nations that are under the king's dominion obey him, and fall away every one from the religion of their fathers, and give consent to his commandments, yet will I and my sons and my brethren walk in the covenant of our fathers. God forbid that we should forsake the law and the ordinances. We will not hearken to the king's words to go from our religion either to the right hand or to the left. Now when he had left speaking these words, there came one of the Jews in the sight of all to sacrifice on the altar that was at Modin, according to the king's commandment. You know, there's always some weaselly little character that will be ready to come up and sort of take advantage of the opportunity. And so when Matthias and his family refused to participate, here was this guy that said, I will. You want somebody to sacrifice? I want to be the king's friend. I'd like to get silver and gold. I want to fit in with everybody. I'll just come right on up there. I'll do it. Which thing, when Matthias saw, he was inflamed with zeal, and his reins trembled. Neither could he forbear to show his anger according to judgment, wherefore he ran and slew him upon the altar. Well, that got everybody's attention in a hurry. Also, the king's commissioner, who compelled men to sacrifice, he killed at the same time. And then he pulled the altar down. Thus did he zealously for the law of God, like as Phinehas. Now, Phinehas was his ancestor. If you want to go back and read the story in the book of Numbers, Phinehas was the grandson of Aaron. And if you remember the story in the book of Numbers, Israel had come up to the area there of the plains of Moab, plains of Jordan. And the king of Moab knew that he and the Midianites were not able to defeat Israel militarily. But he wanted to get rid of them, and he wanted to get rid of them very badly. So much so that he sent to the greatest pagan priest of the ancient world. He sent to Balaam, way up there. As you look at a map, you'll find they journeyed several hundred miles. They didn't need just their average run-of-the-mill, ordinary witch doctor. They needed the real thing. See, so they sent for Balaam, and Balaam, who we're told in the New Testament, loved the wages of unrighteousness. You know, old Balaam, he was if you'd pay him good, he'd do just about anything. And Balaam really wanted to come down there and put a curse on Israel. But he got down there and he realized, you know, God told him, said, I'm not going to let you can't curse them. I'm not going to allow a curse on Israel. Balaam knew that, and he puzzled over it, and we're told later, again in the New Testament, as the story is expounded, we're told that Balaam taught Balak to cause Israel to sin. Balaam's suggestion was, look, send the girls down and invite the boys on up to celebrate. And the next thing you know, they're going to be fornicating, and they're going to be dancing around the idol altars and bowing down to the idols. They're going to start doing all of the things that God condemns, the God of Israel condemns. And he'll get so disgusted with them, he'll wipe them out. That was Balaam's idea. And as you go through the story back there, and as it occurred, you find that things had gotten so blatant that here came this Israelite fella with the Midianite girl, just brazenly right into the camp, brought her into the tent. Just, open fornication, immorality. Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, was so stirred up that he grabbed a spear, ran into the tent, and skewered him to the ground. And the aftermath of that was that God made a covenant of the priesthood with Phinehas, that the descendants of Phinehas would retain the high priesthood. Well, anyway, Matthias was he was a chip off the old block. Phinehas was his grandfather many times removed, and thus did he zealously for the law of God, like as Phinehas did to Zambri. And Matthias cried throughout the city with a loud voice, saying, "Whosoever is zealous of the law and maintains the covenant, let him follow me." So he and his sons fled into the mountains and left all that they ever had in the city. And this launched what is known in history as the Maccabean revolt, which lasted over a 3-year period. During the course of these 3 years, Matthias died. And we're told here that when the time drew near that Matthias should die, he said unto his sons, "Now has pride and rebuke gotten strength in the time of destruction and the wrath of indignation. Now therefore, my sons, be zealous for the law, and give your lives for the covenant of your fathers. Call to remembrance what acts our fathers did in their time. So shall you receive great honor and an everlasting name. Was not Abraham found faithful in temptation, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness? Joseph, in the time of his distress, kept the commandments and was made Lord of Egypt. Phinehas, our father, in being zealous and fervent, obtained the covenant of an everlasting priesthood. Joshua, for fulfilling the word, was made a judge in Israel. Caleb, for bearing witness before the congregation, received the heritage of the land. David, for being merciful, possessed the throne of an everlasting kingdom. Elijah, for being zealous and fervent for the law, was taken up. Ananias, Azariah, and Mishael, better known to us by their Babylonian names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, by believing were saved out of the flame. Daniel, for his innocency, was delivered from the mouth of lions. Thus consider you throughout all ages that none that put their trust in him shall be overcome. Fear not then the words of a sinful man, for his glory shall be dung and worms. Today he shall be lifted up, and tomorrow he shall not be found, because he is returned to his dust, and his thought is come to nothing. Wherefore, my sons, be valiant, and show yourselves men in behalf of the law, for by it you shall obtain glory. And he went on and appointed Judas Maccabee, his son, as their captain. As for Judas Maccabeus, he has been mighty and strong even from his youth up. Let him be your captain and fight the battle of the people. And so he went on and blessed them and died. Well, the story continues. Judas Maccabee led the army in, and then they reconquered Jerusalem, reconquered the Temple Mount, and came there and rededicated the temple just a little over 3 years afterward. They built a new altar, as it describes, and then on the 25th day of the 9th month, the month Keslev, they rose up early in the morning and offered sacrifice upon the new altar of burnt offerings. And look at what time and what day the nations had profaned it. Even in that was it dedicated with songs and various instruments of music. And so they kept the dedication of the altar 8 days, offered burnt offerings with gladness, and sacrificed the sacrifice of deliverance and praise. And Judas and his brethren, with the whole congregation of Israel, ordained that the days of the dedication of the altar would be kept in their season from year to year by the space of 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month Keslev. And that occurred in the beginning portion of the month of December this particular year. Jesus Christ himself went up to the temple as described there in John 10 at that occasion. People were gathered there. Not a holy day commanded of God, but a national day of celebration and festivity. We might liken it to Thanksgiving Day or to the 4th of July in the sense that it commemorated the independence of the nation and the rededication of the temple, God's deliverance. Because you see, that mighty Greek army of Antiochus, that empire that stretched across such a swath of the Middle East, was defeated by this handful of troops under Judas Maccabee. And 3 years, just over 3 years from the abomination that made desolate, the temple was purged and cleansed and rededicated. You see, as Daniel prophesied, such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupt by flatteries. Those who were enticed, well, you can fit in. You'll be just like everybody else. Everybody's doing it. You'll be one of the king's friends. There's money in it for you. You see, those who do wickedly against the covenant are corrupt by flatteries. Notice that the wickedness precedes the corruption. You see, they're corrupt by flatteries. There's a reason why they were corrupt by flatteries. Because they did not love God's way. They didn't love God's law. They didn't love God's covenant. And so they were enticed because here was something they loved more. And they fit in and desired to fit in. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. This was a contrast that's described as you go through the story of the Maccabees. But it is a story that comes all the way down through Scripture, and it comes all the way down to our day. Because ultimately, you have this dichotomy. You have those who are corrupted by flatteries and those who know their God. And there is a contrast between the two. We could go through and one died. And they buried him. And that entire generation died. And then we find in verse 11 of Joshua 2 that the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Eternal and served Baal. They forsook the eternal God of their fathers that brought them out of the land of Egypt, followed other gods, the gods of the nations round about. They bowed themselves to them, provoked the Lord to anger. Forsook the Eternal, served Baal and Ashtaroth. The anger of the Eternal was hot against Israel, and he delivered them into the hands of the spoilers that spoiled them. Sold them into the hands of the enemies round about. And it describes that they cried out to God, and God raised up judges. And they didn't listen to the judges very well, went whoring after other gods, verse 17. Verse 18, when the Lord raised up judges, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. God felt sorry for them because of their groanings and their difficulties. It came to pass, verse 19, when the judge was dead, that they returned and corrupted themselves more than their fathers, in following other gods to serve them and to bow down unto them. They ceased not from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. The anger of the Eternal was hot against Israel. And he said, verse 21, I also will not henceforth drive out any from before them of the nations that Joshua left when he died, that through them I may prove Israel whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk therein as their fathers did keep it or not. Therefore the Lord left those nations without driving them out hastily, neither delivered he them into the hands of Joshua. Now, what we find is that God was going to prove Israel, to put them to the test, as it were. It was a test of their affection. A test of their affection, because that's ultimately one of the major things that God is concerned with. Whom do we love? Do we truly love Him and His ways? And do we love Him more than we love the enticements of the world around? God did not want Israel simply to make a decision by default. Now, there was a time during the leadership of Moses, during the leadership of Joshua, when there was a strong leader and the truth was emphasized over and over and over. They came into the land, and here are these nations around with all their ideas, with all their customs. Israel had been told, God had told them through Moses, I set before you a choice. I set before you good and evil, life and death. Choose life that you and your seed may live. Notice when God sets a choice, He makes plain what the alternatives are. He didn't say, well, just sort of pick whichever one you like best. He says, I'm going to insist that you choose. But understand what the alternatives are. One of these choices is a good choice and the other is an evil choice. One of these choices will lead to life and the other will lead to death. You need to choose the one that's good and that leads to life. Nevertheless, God insisted that they make a choice. God has always insisted that. You can go right back to the Garden of Eden. God could have ensured there was only one tree in the midst of the garden, the tree of life. It's not that the devil sort of sneaked in and planted the other one when God wasn't looking, sort of sneaked up on God. No. God put two trees there. And He told them, He said, one is going to lead to death and the other is going to lead to life. If you eat this one, don't eat of it, because if you eat it, you'll die. This is the tree of life. But you see, Adam and Eve were enticed. They were persuaded. Eve was persuaded, and Adam just sort of went along. She was deceived. The point is, God sets a choice. He set a choice before ancient Israel. It was not enough just to choose the ways of God. They must also actively reject the alternative. God left these nations there to prove them. What did they really want to do? You see, the test that has come, and we can see it over and over and over down through time, reflects itself in the events that led up to the rededication of the temple and the subsequent feast of dedication. And that is the fact that the world held an allure, an enticement for many people. They wanted to be part of that. They wanted to fit in. They wanted to be part of that Hellenistic world. And they were prepared to turn their back on the ways of God. Some voluntarily did it. They were attracted to it, and they were sort of the leaders. There were others that sort of straddled the fence. But when pressure began to be brought to bear, well, look, it's going to really be to your advantage. In fact, it's going to be to your disadvantage if you don't do it. That'll be the death penalty. But if you do it, well, you'll fit in with everybody else. You'll be one of the king's friends. You'll get ahead. It's the way to be successful. There is an enticement that is there. Now, you see, the issue comes down, as the Apostle Paul explained it in the New Testament, and he was writing to Colossae, which was a Greek city. Understand, Paul was dealing with, in the Gentile world and all over that area, Paul was dealing with people who had been greatly influenced by Greek culture. And here are people, many of whom had grown up just completely enmeshed in it. They were Gentiles by birth, had not grown up even with a knowledge of the law. And they had made an abrupt about-face. They had embraced a different way of life as a result of learning the truth of God. Paul tells them in Colossians 3, verse 1, Colossae, a Greek city in Asia Minor, if you then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sits on the right hand of God. Set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth. You're dead and your life is hid with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then shall you also appear with Him in glory. And so he talked about, in verse 10, putting on the new man, renewed in knowledge after the image of Him that created him. Setting our affection on things above. There are essential areas necessary to maintain faithfulness. And one of those, the first of those, is setting your affection on the things above. What is important to us? Where is our affection set? Paul had to deal with a number of things and the influence and the pressures of Greek culture in his day, the pressures of the world around. He wrote to Timothy, left Timothy in Ephesus to preside over the church there, and Timothy was a young minister that Paul had trained and taught. And Paul wrote back to him and gave him instructions in terms of how to help the people and how to teach them and train them in the way of God. And so in 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul is reminding Timothy about certain things that he had told him earlier, that prayers and intercession be made for all men and for kings and those in authority, for the purpose of 1 Timothy 2:2, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. For this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who will have all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. There's one God and mediator between God and man, the man Jesus Christ, who gave himself a ransom for all, to be testified in due time. So Paul goes on, and notice what he says in verse 8. He says, I will therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands, without wrath and doubting. So Paul emphasizes something that tells Timothy, he says, you need to really instruct the men. I want men everywhere praying, lifting up holy hands. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, holy had to do with what was connected with God. The temple was holy, the holy place, the holy of holies, the holy garments. All of this had to do with coming into the presence of God. And holy hands, your hands are the means by which you do things. That's the things all the actions, the endeavors of your life, you do with your hands. You do things with your hands. And Paul says, now, I want men everywhere to pray. They need to pray lifting up holy hands, hands that are undefiled, unpolluted by being involved in all sorts of ungodly, immoral, worldly, defiling things. Hands that are not involved in greedy, grasping approach to life, stealing and hurting and involved in immorality and involved in doing things that are wrong. Lift up holy hands. Hands that are not defiled by ungodly behavior. And to do so, praying without wrath and without doubting. It's natural and normal for men to get stirred up and people to want to get even with someone. If you have to put away wrath, to put away the whole idea of getting even and getting back at someone, of avenging yourself. Well, that was very much part of the ideal of the Greek world. Without doubting, without having an attitude of trust and faith and confidence in God. So Timothy was to emphasize certain things to the men. What it meant to lift up holy hands, to avoid wrath, to avoid doubting. Then he went on, verse 9, in like manner also. So here's something he wanted him to emphasize to the women. That women adorn themselves in modest apparel. Now, he didn't want them patterning themselves after the Greek courtesans of the first century. These were problems, and Paul felt the need to instruct Timothy and say, you need to emphasize these things. Because they're people who are attracted to what the world has to offer. And the men may be attracted to certain things, and the women may be attracted to certain things. Adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefacedness is the way the King James renders it. It is a term that refers, that gives a connotation in English. It's not really what it, not exactly what we what the original meant. It has to do with a modest demeanor that shines forth from the face, that comes out. You know, our inner attitudes and character is evidenced. I mean, the face is where you have expression. You know, your eyes and your mouth are the way you express your personality and attitude and all sorts of things. You don't look at somebody's elbow to see what kind of mood they're in, but you look at their face. And primarily, the parts of their face that express are the eyes and the mouth. So Paul talks about this inner attitude that is manifested, not this term broided hair with gold or pearls or costly array. In other words, not a world that centers simply on the outward person and outer fashion, but that which becomes women professing godliness with good works. So, Paul emphasizes certain things that Timothy is in turn to teach. And it really gets back as to whether or not the set of values that we love and that we cherish. Do those values derive from the world around us, or do those values derive from God? You know, in 1 John chapter 2, John writes in 1 John 2:15, "Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but it's of the world. The world passes away and the lust thereof, but he that does the will of God abides forever." There's something permanent and there's something transitory. There's something that's going to pass from the scene and be no more, and there's that which is permanent and real and eternal. And ultimately it gets back to, what do we love? What do we cherish? What's important to us? Because you see, what we love and cherish, we will cleave to. And what is not important to us, what we don't really love, we will abandon. And so it comes down to a way of life, to a set of values. I mentioned there are two things that will sustain us from the pressures and the things that will be brought to bear, and from the things that are going to occur. Two things. One is loving God and the things of God, setting our affection on things above, which involves a whole set of values and a way of life. And the other involves trusting God. Trusting God, believing God. You know, you will never abandon what you love. You will not be enticed and attracted by the world if your affections are set on the things above. So the battle begins in the heart. It begins on the inside in terms of what we love, what's important to us. And you see, you and I would never be intimidated by anyone or anything if we truly trusted God. Because that's the situation of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were thrust in. You talk about everybody else doing it. I mean, here they are all out in a public setting. A great statue has been set up. The music starts. Everybody bows down. Pretty obvious, these three guys are still standing up. And they're the only ones out there. And they get called aside and say, now, you know, maybe you fellows didn't hear well, but the king's going to he's going to explain it to you one more time. Everybody bows down to the image. And when the music starts, you hit the dirt. And they said, no, we're not going to do it. They said, well, you know, the alternative is we're going to burn you up in that fiery furnace over there. We're going to throw you in, you're going to sizzle and be gone. You see how hot that thing is? And they said, the God that we serve, you know, they told him first, they said, we don't need time to talk it over and sort of think about it for a while. You know, the decision is already made. We're not going to bow down to the image, and we want you to know that the God whom we serve is the real God, the Creator God, and He can deliver us out of the king's hand. And even if He doesn't choose to do so at this point, we're still not going to bow down to your image. Well, the king was mad and frustrated. He wanted the fire heated hotter than ever. You remember the story. You know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were cast into the fire, and the next thing, the fire was so hot and so intense that the guards fainted and that tried to cast them in. They fainted from the heat and died right there. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fiery furnace. Next thing the king knew, he looked down there and he saw, wait a minute, didn't we throw 3 men in? I see 4 down there, and they're walking in the midst of the fire. And the 4th one looks like the Son of God. Well, that scared him. He called them, asked them if they would please come out. And they came out. Wasn't even the smell of smoke on their garments. You know, God was able to deliver them. Let me show you something back in the end of the book of Revelation. Just notice a contrast. Revelation 13 talks about the beast power. And in verse 16, it talks about the fact that this system caused all, verse 16, Revelation 13:16, caused all, small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. No man might buy or sell except he had the mark, or the name of the beast, the number of his system, number of his name. Here was a mark describes in their foreheads, verse 16. Now notice in chapter 14, sometimes, the chapter breaks cause us to stop at the end of the chapter and not get the full contrast. Notice chapter 14. I looked, and behold, a lamb stood on Mount Zion, referring to Jesus Christ after his return. Mount Zion is the place of the seat of government there in Jerusalem, where David's palace was. A lamb stood on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written in their foreheads. Now here's a contrast. Here are those who had the name of the beast, the mark of the beast in their forehead, and here's those who had the Father's name in their foreheads. Now you can go back and see when this group of people were sealed in Revelation 7. They were sealed after the 6th seal had been opened, before the 7th seal was opened. But they had to make a decision based on faith. Because here was a system dominating the earth, putting tremendous pressure, just as Antiochus put tremendous pressure. First, people had been allured, enticed, and attracted to be part of this system. And there were increasing pressures brought to bear. Now, here is full governmental pressure. You're not going to intimidate people. You're not going to be able to participate. You're not going to be able to hold a job. You're not going to be able to survive. You've got to do it. There's those who are going to look at it that way. So, I didn't have any choice. Oh, yes, we always had a choice. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had a choice. Their choice was to trust God because they loved Him, and they set their affection on things above, and they trusted Him. And they made a choice based on love and trust. And when we make choices based on the love of God and the trust of God, they lead us to a life of dedication to God. And you and I will walk with God and be dedicated to God, and it will be manifested. Christ told His disciples, He said, you're to be the light of the world. You're not to blend in and be part of this society where you can't tell where the world stops and the church starts. You're to be the light of the world. You're to be the salt of the earth. You see, setting our affection on things above, loving God, loving the ways of God, cherishing the things of God, and trusting God, having deep, abiding confidence in God, in God's power, in God's reality. Loving God and trusting God leads to a life of dedication. And those who are so dedicated will not be those who are enticed and attracted away, those who are intimidated away. You know what we all have to examine in our lives, the events that we read in terms of what Daniel prophesied, has implications beyond the days of that time between the Testaments. It has implications beyond the days of Antiochus Epiphanes. It has implications for our future. It has implications for what is described in Revelation 13 and Revelation 17 and 18. It has implications for our future. And so, as we think about that, we realize that the issue is something that runs all throughout Scripture. The time for us to examine right now our dedication and what underlies that dedication. Where is our affection and where is our trust? What do we love and what's really real to us? Because the answers to those two questions The answer to those two questions are the things that will determine the future choices that you and I will make. All of the attractions, all of the enticements, all of the intimidation that the world around us can offer. How do we respond? Well, if we truly love God and we truly trust God, we will be dedicated to God. We will be, as described in Daniel 11, those that do know their God. And to truly know God involves loving Him and trusting Him. If you know God, then you love Him and you trust Him. Those who know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And that is what God has ahead for those who put their trust in Him and set their affections on Him. Those who know their God, who are dedicated to God, will be used of God to accomplish His plan and His purpose.